grateful to each of you for being readers and many of you donors to BNG. And you really make it happen every day with our content, and we're so thrilled about that. One of our goals at BNG is to increase the emphasis of the word global in our name. Some of you will find it ironic that when I was a BNG board member and we adopted the new name, Baptist News Global, through our merger with the Religious Herald, there was one board member who opposed the name, and that was me, because I felt like the word global was awfully aspirational for us, with so much of our content being domestic. But we're working on that, and I hope you're seeing that as we go. And one of the ways that we want to engage that tonight is by having a conversation about global issues. And we've found a wonderful expert in that. And Knox, we're so glad to have you join us tonight. We share a connection to Kentucky, where I lived for 8 years and served as news editor and then editor of the Western Recorder, which, by the way, just died or is dying at the end of March. They're closing it. We had a story about that, but anyhow, Knox grew up in Kentucky in a Baptist home and went to Georgetown College. And we're pleased to have with us participating in the webinar tonight, Bill Crouch, who is the former president of Georgetown College, as a good friend to BNG as well. And then Knox has gone on to greater glory beyond Kentucky. I know it's hard to imagine, but it's true. And you've read his bio and so forth. And Knox, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us tonight.
It's a great pleasure, and I see some names in the attendees who are old friends. So while I too am sorry we can't be all together, I am glad we're together tonight, and I look forward to the conversation.
So Knox wrote a beautiful piece for us about loving our global neighbor. And I thought it'd be appropriate to begin our conversation tonight by asking, let's talk just a little bit about why we should love our global neighbor and what that means. That you unpack that just in a brief column, but obviously there's more to it than that.
Yeah, and I think I'll start by answering that question by telling a story that really begins back in the 1800s when American missionaries decided to were following the Great Commission and going to all ends of the earth. This one group went to a very far away place, literally on the other side of the planet, to plant churches, to help share the gospel of Jesus Christ. It was a predominantly Muslim environment. Conversions were few. Their message wasn't received well, and they had a decision to make. Do we pack it up and go back to the United States, or do we find other ways to demonstrate God's love to these people? They're not ready. They're not open to hearing the ultimate message of God's love about Jesus Christ. Are there other ways we could serve them? So they realized this is a incredibly impoverished area. There are no roads and there are no hospitals or no schools. So these missionaries started opening hospitals, started opening schools, started bringing education and healthcare, saved countless lives. And then in the 1960s, this part of the world, which is the Persian Gulf, discovered huge deposits of oil and natural gas along the rim of the Persian Gulf. And so these different emirates like Oman, UAE, Bahrain, literally went from third world countries where people would die of starvation, high infant mortality rates, to first world countries with per capita incomes greater than a lot of European countries. But because of that testimony of those missionaries who stayed there to show God's love to their neighbor, through healthcare, through education, the ruling elites had this wonderful understanding of Christianity. And if you look at the neighborhood, you've got Saudi Arabia on one side, you've got Iran on the other, very hostile places to religious freedom, very hostile places to religious minorities. But in these Persian Gulf Emirates, where these missionaries were able to work, they're bastions of tolerance. You can find churches, you can find soon a new synagogue is going to be opening in Abu Dhabi. You'll even find Hindu temples, because of this message of love that Christians demonstrated, this showing what it means to be a neighbor it revolutionized the area in a very positive way, so that now there's not full religious freedom, but there's certainly a firm foundation of tolerance and understanding that one day I think could continue to grow all the way up to religious freedom. So in this column I wrote, I was trying just to challenge all of us to think about what can we do to be a good global neighbor. I pointed to the biblical call, looking at Micah 6:8, which I've got hung here in our home office. Christians are to act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. But then I also looked at the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 as the ultimate example of what does it mean to be a neighbor. And you have the story of this traveler was beset upon by robbers. And as Jesus tells this parable to an inquisitive attorney who was trying to stump him, it shows that people from the traveler's own community passed by on the other side. But it was a Samaritan who came by and is the hero of the story. And I think one of the things I find so interesting about this parable is in biblical times, Jews and Samaritans were against each other. They hated each other. Samaritans were viewed as religiously and ethnically different. And by Jesus choosing the Samaritan to be the hero, having someone who reached across these religious lines, with a powerful message, with a big twist in the story. And then the lawyer says, what are we to do? And Christ says, go and do likewise. So I think there's an opportunity now, as our world gets smaller, for all of us who are Christ followers to be thinking about, how do we go and do likewise? How do we go and be a good neighbor, literally to the people next door to us, but also with the global reach of the United States today, that we can be a good neighbor to people who are suffering around the world.
Thank you. That's a beautiful introduction to this conversation, and is a perfect lead-in to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is some of us have noticed through the years, if we're old enough and been around the Baptist church, maybe other denominations are like this. I can speak for Baptists. We historically really love the idea of loving our global neighbor as long as they're away from us somewhere. We love to send missionaries to help save people, and sometimes to provide hospitals and other water wells and things like that. But we seem to not always feel the same level of love when they come to us. That the whole global neighbor thing is great as long as they're global and not local. How do these two things relate in your understanding?
Well, as someone who's been working in human rights and religious freedom issues until very recently, until this summer, in government for 20 years, I've seen the ability of the United States government, representing all of us, to be a force for good in the world, to be an advocate for the persecuted, but also for our country to be a haven for those fleeing persecution. This really came home to me when, right after I graduated at Georgetown College, it was actually while I was at Georgetown College, I learned of an opportunity to join AmeriCorps, which is domestic Peace Corps equivalent, down in Atlanta to help resettle refugees. And, my parents were a great influence on me. They were teachers in Richmond, Kentucky. My mom actually started the AmeriCorps program at Eastern Kentucky University. So I was familiar with the program, and I had this interest in international affairs. So I moved down to Atlanta to work with refugees. And, Kentucky, growing up in Kentucky in the 80s and 90s, I looked at census data later, and Kentucky was the second most homogeneous state in the country, second to like New Hampshire.
Yes.
So there just wasn't a lot of diversity when I was growing up, but thanks to my parents instilling this, curiousness about the world, and bringing people into our home who were from India or Iran, who were exchange students, they helped expose us to different people, but still not a lot of diversity growing up. Once I got to Atlanta, I had friends who had come to the United States as refugees, who had fled horrific things because they believed in the wrong thing, they were the wrong tribe or ethnicity, and they'd suffered unimaginable cruelty because of it. But the United States had provided a refuge and a safe haven for them. And now they're some of the most productive Americans you could imagine, because they have an appreciation for what we have that I think most Americans don't have. When the coronavirus was really starting to hit the United States, and a lot of localities started closing churches and public places, and I started hearing concerns that, well, this is persecution. The church in America is being persecuted through these closings. I was actually lucky enough to I wrote an article for Christianity Today, which they used, where I respectively said, these church closures are inconvenient, they're disconcerting, they're disruptive, that might be illegal, but it's not persecution. Like I have met persecuted Christians. I have seen what happens to them when, commandos raid the church and take everyone to jail, or in other communities like Uyghurs in China, which the Trump administration, one of its last acts was to declare China's committing a genocide against Uyghur Muslims, which I completely agree with. These existential violent situations, that's persecution. And so what we're experiencing here is a challenge, but we have to keep it in context and be very careful about our terminology. So how do we love our neighbor, who are overseas? Well, we can leverage the strength and might and influence of the United States to be a force for good. But also I welcome the Biden administration announcing they're going to increase the number of refugees we're going to take in to over 100,000. That's the right thing to do. It's always glad World Relief and the National Association of Evangelicals and others have been very supportive of that. That's the right thing to do. That's just a way the United States can continue to be this safe haven that we've been throughout our history for those fleeing persecution.
Well, thank you for that. Just a personal word while you catch your breath for a moment, to say that I'm sitting tonight in my little office at the Gaston Christian Center in Dallas, which is a home to 8 ethnic congregations that meet under one roof in a building, where we have the largest charity medical and dental clinic in Dallas County housed, and the largest refugee resettlement ministry in Dallas County housed right here in this very building where I sit.
Wow.
And I chose to be here for a reason, not just because I've been involved in this organization from its beginning, but because I wanted to be reminded every day, thinking I was coming to office more than I actually am now because of the pandemic, but I wanted to be reminded of the very thing you just said, which leads into the next line of thought. Like you, I grew up in a Baptist church in Oklahoma instead of Kentucky, but I know that church experience, that rich church experience that you had growing up, and then going to a faith-based school on top of that, a well-known in Kentucky especially place for faith formation. Looking back, how has all of that helped shape who you are today and given you a perspective?
Yeah, I want to turn to my parents, an example that they demonstrated every day just by being teachers and this emphasis on giving back. Both of them focusing on Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, where there is a need for good schools and encouragement for kids to finish. So that was always there. My church home growing up, First Baptist of Richmond, was a very missions-oriented church. We did lots of mission trips around the state and around the region. Everything from VBS to the Meals on Wheels type examples of charity. And then when I came to Georgetown, I spent a lot of time, and Dr. Crouch will remember, and others might too, Doc Birdwhistle, who was just a beautiful man, and so tragic that he has passed away. But he was a very powerful influence on me and so many others in a positive way to have a broader perspective. And then it was this mix of exposure at Georgetown to doing mission work. I was very involved in BSU, but then also another Georgetown professor, Dr. Heiser, encouraged me to go study in Poland one summer. And that really kind of put me on a trajectory where I am today, focusing on international affairs, because I went to Poland in 1995. I didn't speak Polish. Looking back on it, it's a miracle I came back, because I was so naive. I'd never ridden a public bus, never flown internationally, and here I was going to this foreign country. But it was, a fantastic experience to see a country emerging just a couple of years after the end of the Cold War and removal of the Iron Curtain, and how they were dealing with openness and diversity and freedoms. And then, then in Doc's office at my senior year, I learned about this AmeriCorps opportunity in Atlanta. And so, all of these sort of pieces, you don't see it at the moment, were, steps in a path that I believe God was setting out in front of me. And, my AmeriCorps experience in Atlanta working at World Relief was so good. I even met my wife. She moved there to do the same AmeriCorps volunteer thing from Texas. And we met, had an office romance, and 22 years later and 2 kids, we're having a lot of fun still. So this human rights work can be romantic, I like to say. So it's just sort of always fun to think back and see those steps, because you don't see them in the moment, how the Lord's putting them out in front of you.
So I think most of us average people have a hard time comprehending what it is you have done in your career and what it is you are doing in your career. I'm sure you get asked this a lot, like, what does that really mean? Okay, I can read the words on the title. I understand what they mean, but I'm still clueless.
I've had a very interesting career that literally some of the places I've worked at didn't exist when I was in college. And so I couldn't even have, hoped to work at these places because they had yet to be created by Congress. So I've worked in a variety of different government institutions, all focused on human rights and religious freedom promotion. Right after law school, I moved up from Atlanta up to DC for law school, and then stayed because there's just a fascinating, universe of jobs here. I got a job at a small commission that focused on human rights in Europe and the former Soviet Union. So I spent a lot of time focusing on places I'd never heard of, like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. But those were the focal points of religious persecution. But also what was interesting about this religious freedom work was it was also relevant in France, as they deal with their hyper-secularism. And they don't understand what happens when people want to wear a cross in the lapel, or a yarmulke, or a woman, heaven forbid, wear a Muslim scarf. So I saw how this issue is one where countries everywhere grapple with it. And from there, I had a brief stint at the State Department, and then was the policy director for 8 years at a special commission that Congress created to monitor religious freedom worldwide. And it's an independent think tank that advises the State Department and the White House and the Congress, and was able to do a lot of interesting things, focusing on Pakistan and Afghanistan, but then also looking to build alliances between different parliamentarians, bringing them together around the issue of religious freedom. And then most recently, I received an appointment, a civil service appointment during the Obama administration to serve as a special envoy on religious minorities in the Middle East and South and Central Asia. And since I was a career civil servant, that appointment fit well. And then when the Trump administration came in, they asked me to stay. So I was in that position for about 5 years, working in both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And, very interesting comparison between 2 different ways to do foreign policy. And then just to fast forward, this summer I left, and very fortunate to receive the grant to write a book on my 20 years of work in this space and develop recommendations for how do we defeat religious persecution in the 21st century, so we're still not dealing with it when we get to the 22nd. But I'll be drawing on a lot of the work I did for the Obama and Trump administrations. The Trump administration on international religious freedom did more than any other administration ever. I was a part of the movement. It was my idea to have the 2 summits that they convened in Washington 2 summers ago, where we brought together over 100 governments, 1,000 members of civil society, religious communities of every stripe and color, as well as people who don't believe, the atheist community as well, to talk about how do we work together to advance religious freedom for all. And then was tasked with building a new alliance of countries that would take this to the next step. So there was a lot of good, I think we did, working with my fellow civil servants. We were very fortunate to have Sam Brownback being the ambassador at large for international religious freedom. He was the senator and then governor of Kansas. And I give him a lot of credit. He did this the right way, focusing on religious freedom for everybody. Of course, if Christians are persecuted, we want to talk about that, and we did. But also when Muslims are persecuted, or Hindus, or people who don't hold a certain belief, we spoke out for them as well. So it was a very interesting 5 years in that role. And it shows, I think I saw a lot about what the United States can do, but also the limits of government influence. And it's going to take conversations like this, like how do we get the average person who's not, is not in a national capital to support religious freedom for the other. That, of course you want it for you and yours, but you also need to be as active for the other as well. And that's, I think, is the next frontier for this work.
Well, and those of us who know anything of our Baptist history know that that's a fundamental part of our heritage, is not just seeking religious liberty for ourselves, but also for all other people. And that's part of what's been under attack in the United States, is a redefining of what religious persecution or religious liberty is. But I want to circle back to, you talked about this on the global scene, and the kinds of things you saw and have seen. How would you define for a layperson what religious persecution globally is? What crosses the line?
I think the key element in understanding if something is persecution is violence involved, either violence from the state, violence from an independent actor. And I've written about how there's really a spectrum of problems, with persecution being at the far end. You can have harassments, limitations, discrimination, repression, and then you get to the really violent persecution that is often life and death. And it's really important, I think, that we as Christians, and really anyone who wants to advocate for the repressed, that you're very careful about your terminology. If you call everything persecution, then nothing's persecution. And, throughout my career, I've experienced people who come in and say, we need help, we're being persecuted. And, the places I've worked for were kind of geared to receive those complaints and to find ways to leverage U.S. influence. And then you start digging into the case file, and it was bad, it was wrong, but it wasn't persecution. I had one Christian leader talk about the persecution people have experienced because their tent revival permit was denied. Okay, that's discriminatory. You don't like that. It's not persecution. And so we just need to be careful that it needs to be violent, it needs to be targeted. And oftentimes if there's a motive involved, like it's not accidental, it's not carpet bombing, it's like we're going after you because of what you believe or what you represent or who you're fighting for, and we're going to make you pay and scare you and scare others through the way that you're treated.
That's great. That's really, really helpful. Thank you. So I think most of us in the United States are overwhelmed by the global scene. It's just more than most of us can comprehend. And so we tune out a lot of it. Maybe walk us through, from your perspective, what are some of the current hot spots, the current hot issues with religious minorities and persecution that we ought to clear the clutter, and we ought to pay attention to those things?
That's a great question. Stepping back to the macro, there was a report that came out not too long ago from the Pew Forum that's for the past, 5 or 7 years has been tracking annually instances of religious repression. And the numbers are bad. 2/3 of the global community live in countries where there are restrictions on the free practice of faith. Now, that doesn't mean everyone is persecuted, but it does mean there are very narrow lanes of permissible religious activity. And if someone steps out of those lanes, they're going to face a world of hurt, either from governments or societal actors, or a lot of times both. So the global scene is bad, and it is overwhelming because it is such a massive problem. So China, it's top of the list. What they're doing to the Uyghur Muslims is genocide. I was glad that then Secretary Pompeo called it that, and Secretary Designate Blinken just last week said he agrees with it. So that'll be a very strong message. But this is what the Chinese have been doing to the Tibetan Buddhists, to independent Christians, to Falun Gong. So we know this playbook, and it's going to take a lot of work a lot of effort, really, that only the United States can lead to push back against the Chinese because they're becoming so strong. So China is like its own category. But then you've got places like Burma or Myanmar with what they're doing towards the Rohingya Muslims, and also ethnic Christian groups. Pakistan and India, very concerned about where they are going. Pakistan's been a problem for a while due to Islamic extremism. And now in India, you have the rise of Hindu extremism that is starting to sort of pull that country away from its secular foundations. In the Arab world, there's not a lot of freedom of conscience for Muslims or non-Muslims. It's a very tightly controlled space for freedom of thought. And I think that's in that space, converts, especially Christian converts out of Islam, face a lot of problems. But so there's a growing number of people who are saying, I just don't believe in anything. I'm agnostic. And you've seen those governments really target the atheist and agnostic community, calling them terrorists, actually, because for them to say they just don't believe in anything. And so those are two communities, converts and atheists, who clearly would not have a lot in common, but they do suffer repression from the same sort of societal and legal superstructure. So helping one helps the other, and both groups are often forgotten. Iran's a problem, Eritrea, North Korea, bad stuff happening in Russia, Saudi Arabia. But there is good news. I don't want to be all negative. In the last year, we've seen remarkable changes in Sudan, which had this Islamist-led military regime for 25 years. Through popular revolt, Omar al-Bashir was overthrown. Now there's a civilian council. I worked with them a lot when I was at the State Department, along with Ambassador Brownback, to push them in the right direction. And they recently actually removed that most Arab Muslim countries have blasphemy or apostasy, criticizing Islam or changing faith carries the death penalty. Sudan removed that penalty. It's still a crime, but the death penalty is gone. And you just don't see that happening. So that's unusual. That's a positive. They're reopening churches. They're restoring land that was taken. And that is a big part I think we can be proud of as Americans, that but for the United States, I don't think a lot of those changes would have happened. Because we were using our tools of influence to lead them on a better path. And also Uzbekistan, which is far away. A lot of people haven't heard of it. Former Soviet Republic. Again, a new leadership came into power, and they've gone on a remarkable reform effort, registering churches, letting people out of jail for conservative Islamic religious ideas, letting children go to mosque and religious schools. So there's a challenge out there, but we're seeing that concerted international engagement can move the needle. And that's something that I was working on by building this new Religious Freedom Alliance of governments. How do we harness this interest and put lead in the target downrange to really see things change? And it can happen. It's a lot of work, but I think we're seeing some of the positives of those efforts.
So your answer reminds me of the fact that at the end of the last legislative session, right at the very tail end, both the House and the Senate finally approved this resolution calling on an end to blasphemy and heresy laws globally.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you might have had something to do with that along the way. If so, maybe you could talk about that. And my other question about it is, will that make any difference, or is it just us saying we think this is a good idea?
Yeah, well, is Pakistan, which has the worst blasphemy laws in the world, and Pakistan has more people in jail for the crime of blasphemy than every other country combined times 3. So Pakistan's like in its own, it's the worst on blasphemy. It doesn't care what our Congress did. At the same time, I think anytime our legislators speak to these issues in a united way, in a concerted way, it's a good thing, because countries do notice. And it's also an important tool to educate congressmen about events outside the United States. Now, when I came to Washington, there were several congressmen. There was a good solid group of congressmen and senators who were very strong advocates for religious freedom for everybody. And through retirements and lost political races, the numbers have dwindled. And I think, seeing that resolution offered and seeing it pass got more members engaged in an issue that many have just, because their constituents aren't asking them to, haven't gotten engaged on. So it matters. I think, though, in a lot of these countries, it's going to take getting Muslim religious leaders on board, saying, yes, we don't want to say offensive things about the founder of our faith. Yes, we wish people would stay Muslims, but we need them to also say people have the right to be critical. People have the right to pursue truth as their conscience leads. There was a remarkable statement made by Morocco's Islamic Leadership Council to that effect, saying that it's a sin to change, to leave Islam. It's a sin to criticize Prophet Muhammad, but that's for God to decide how that sin is accounted for. It's not up to us. And that's a big deal. So it's going to take a lot of engagement, a lot of continued conversations, I think, to really win the day on this one.
Well, thank you. That's a great answer. And by the way, shout out to our friends at BJC who were part of that effort. And that was a bipartisan resolution, by the way. This, I know it's shocking, but it really was a bipartisan effort there. Before I ask the next question, I want to say to everyone on the webinar, please begin to enter the questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we'll take those as they come around. This is a good time to start typing in questions that you have. So Knox, a lot of us not only have trouble understanding the global scene, but we have trouble understanding what we can do to make a difference about it. And it's maybe easier for us to advocate for the local food bank or for the kids at the elementary school down the street or whatever. What are some ideas on how average Americans like us, churchgoers, people of faith who care, can become advocates for global neighbors?
Yeah, that is the $64,000 question, which I guess is dating me a little bit. Of course, prayer. It's kind of trite to say, well, of course you should pray, but of course we should pray. Like, that is really the best answer, and one I am often guilty of forgetting about, that we ask God to get engaged in the world, to use us, his people, to bring about a better place. And, hopefully through that, he will open up our eyes to see opportunities to engage. In the piece, I did identify several organizations that you can partner with. I work for the Institute for Global Engagement, which is a Christian faith-based religious freedom NGO that was founded by the first religious freedom ambassador at the State Department, Bob Seipel, who was also the president of World Vision for a while. And while we hold our Christian faith dearly and are evangelical in outlook, we also advocate for the conscious rights for everybody, because we know that an environment where everyone has freedom to seek truth is going to be an environment where Christians will have the brightest future. But the scourge of slavery and sex trade, got an organization like International Justice Mission. If you're worried about refugees, there's World Relief, which has done fantastic work. So there are those groups you can partner with, you can support financially and through prayer, but then also get your member of Congress engaged. Call them up, write them, both your representative and your senator, because they can engage bilaterally with a foreign government that's persecuting. They can press the State Department to do more, and they also can influence appropriations. Like, they can provide money or take money away if they're unhappy with it, and that's a very powerful tool. So I think that'll keep you busy if you're focusing on those three things. That's a great way to start. But because these neighbors who are suffering are far away, it's not going to be as immediate as helping the person you see broken down on the side of the road or the soup kitchen, like you said. But we know with these platforms like Zoom, we can touch the world and communicate in very positive ways that were unimaginable, frankly, 18 months ago, let alone 10 years ago. So how can we be entrepreneurial in our thinking about how to impact the world in a positive way?
Wow, that's really really spot on, I think. And one of the things that we often say, and it happens all the time here at Gaston Christian Center that I mentioned, is instead of us going to the world has in a way come to us
Yeah.
through immigration, through asylum seekers. And I know so many people today that I would not have known 20 years ago. You were spot on about Kentucky. I remember writing a story about that 25 years ago or so. It was the second most homogenous state in the union. And it's just crazy. The whole idea of migrants from Mexico was brand new at the time. And there were Mission Service Corps volunteers. Some of you Texans will know this is Albert Reyes's parents, who came to Kentucky, and Gus Reyes, who came to Kentucky to work with migrants. And that was just revolutionary at the time. But today, it's pretty easy to know someone from another country, right? Here in the United States. And I think that helps shape our compassion and our understanding on that. Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, Rick has asked this question. Would violent attacks upon Black churches, synagogues, and mosques by white Christian nationalists in the US be considered persecution? You see that question?
Well, at the individual level, it certainly could be. If there's what our Black African American brothers and sisters experienced with the lynchings and the KKK and segregation and the violence, they were persecuted. So anytime there's this targeted attack that's motivated by hate, that's using violence against an other, it can be, certainly have persecutorial intent. I think the thing that makes me hesitate a little bit is because we are a nation of laws, because we do take these types of crimes very seriously, there will be accountability. And oftentimes another element in a situation of persecution is there's no accountability. The persecutor is free to do it, maybe is even praised for doing it, or is the government's doing it, like it's the government policy to persecute. So I think I would be hesitant to call that persecution, that we'd have a system of persecution here today, because we have, if someone's murdered, the murderer will be tracked down, hopefully prosecuted and sent to jail. And that's an element that's missing in so many of those places that I mentioned earlier where persecution is rampant.
That's an interesting distinction that you've made there. And I there's another question that's come across that's sort of parallel to this, and this is not necessarily criminal behavior, but annoying behavior. Some American Christians feel like they're persecuted when someone doesn't say Merry Christmas to them and says Happy Holidays, or some perceived slight like that. That's not even illegal, but this is the persecution of Christians, and it's going to lead to. I think it's a slippery slope argument a lot of times that this is the beginning of we're going to end up like this other country. Thoughts?
Yeah, I just disagree. It's a bad day in the United States is better literally than just about anywhere else in the world on issues of religious freedom. I mean, we have such religious freedom here. I was reading David French, and he talks he's a religious liberty lawyer earlier in his career, and he talks about how there's like a 10-year win streak at the Supreme Court on domestic religious liberty issues. So yeah, we've got to continue to perfect how the right is respected here. And it's going to be more challenging as we become more diverse and have more perspectives and belief systems. But, I pray for the day when a country like Pakistan is debating, what is the right thing for a baker to do? One of the things I normally deal with are, people were just lynched and murdered in the street, and the police arrested the victims and not the murderers. I mean, that's the reality of persecution globally. That's the reality for men and women around the world. It's just violence that is unaccounted for. That's persecution. Not to say what we have here isn't problematic, discriminatory, maybe illegal, but it's a long way away from what the term really means.
So another person's asked the question, how do we encourage balance and not engaging in help that hurts when we're working abroad. Americans, he says, often lurch between indifference about persecution overseas or anything else happening out beyond our borders to insisting that Muslim or other cultures that don't respect individual conscience suddenly observe religious freedom as we understand it. How do we not engage in help that hurts?
Yeah, no, I think this is where, we talk about, when I was in government, this sort of using the Hippocratic Oath as a model for how you do human rights advocacy. Like, that number one rule is do no harm. Because when the United States gets engaged, we can be a force for good, but we bring a lot of baggage. Because we're a superpower and we're engaged on military issues, energy issues, trade issues. There's a lot of juggling that has to go on, and for those of us who work in human rights, work to advance human rights, representing a superpower, it's a tricky business, because as much as I'm inspired by our ideals and I want our government to live up to that and how we engage the world, we don't, and we fall short. And there is a hypocrisy gap between our stated ideals and how we engage countries. And we'll be very critical of one country who's an adversary and turn a blind eye to the same treatment in a country that's a partner. And so when we would have people bringing concerns to us, the first question is, do you want us to say anything? Do you want us to do anything? Because it's bringing in, potentially a bull in a china shop. Now, we try to be sophisticated and nuanced, but just because we're so big and powerful, we were very mindful to be careful about it. But when the United States engages, countries have to listen. When we name people who are in jail and ask for them to be released, that request gets a hearing in a way that when smaller countries raise it, is just ignored. Or when we ask for laws to be changed, or a reorientation of policies. If my former colleagues and I were successful in winning those internal battles, we can bring a lot of force into the sort of battle space on the side of good. And so that's why so many of us did that, and many colleagues still do that inside government, pushing to do the right thing.
So how important or not important is the role of a U.S. ambassador or an ambassador's staff in countries? Do they have any ability? Well, first of all, do they have any understanding of these issues? And I know it may vary, but do they have any ability to affect a difference?
Absolutely. I'm proud to say that, because Congress mandated this, every American embassy in the world has a diplomat whose job is focused on human rights and religious freedom. No other country in the world can say that. Like, the amount of diplomatic resources that we contribute and commit for human rights and religious freedom is second to none. So there's always someone on staff who's following these issues. We write a report on every country in the world on human rights, the State Department does, as well as a report on every country in the world on religious freedom. There's also a report on trafficking in persons. Like, we do a lot to document the crimes that have happened, or positive things that have happened as well. So, every country from Andorra to Zambia is covered in these reports, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But just the mere documenting drives the bad countries crazy, which I think is great. So it encourages the repressed, and it's a goad in the side of the powerful, the repressor. And that's a great simple way to just shine a light on something. We put it in a report, we put it in writing that this person's in jail for this reason. And then that empowers our ambassador to find opportunities to raise these issues. Now, ambassador is a very busy person. He or she has got to carry the whole gamut of U.S. relationships, everything from like Peace Corps volunteers to, loose nukes, to drugs, to trade, everything. And so they've got a very full plate. But, I've seen where those ambassadors can go in and get a meeting and, on behalf of all of us, represent our values and ask for people to be set free or for policies to change, and it can make a difference.
Wow. I've got another question that someone's asked. I'm going to come to in a minute, but I don't want to give up that thread that we're on right now, because it seems that we're at one of those inflection points with any change in administrations where we're going to have new ambassadors appointed who go into all these countries mainly. And some are career diplomats, some are political appointees, and everything in between. Uh, Given what you know about the way things work, if the White House were to call you up and say, "Hey, what advice do you have for us as we work on global relations?" What would be your top 2 or 3 pieces of advice to them?
I just wrote an article that was published in the Harvard Human Rights Journal called Consequential Human Rights Policies. And it's an article with advice for the new administration saying if the United States says human rights matter, then they need to matter. And so we can't say we're committed to human rights, it's a reflection of American values, and then still ignore Egypt arresting hundreds and hundreds of people and sentencing them to death. We can't ignore Saudi Arabia chopping up a journalist and pretending like it didn't happen. We can't ignore India and its turn towards Hindu extremism and the persecution of Muslim and Christians. Like this, if human rights matter, my advice is then we have to have consequences for abuses. And I think China shows what happens when there is that gap, when there's a policy of all carrots and no sticks. Like we would say, yes, we'll trade with China, and you better be better on human rights. And the Chinese would nod, oh yeah, we're going to get right to that, but first we want to build this Ford plant or whatever as iPhone factory, and they took it and ran. And the situation is worse than it was 20 years ago, and they're stronger than they were 20 years ago, because we didn't create consequences when we kept seeing continual human rights violations. So that's really at the end of the day, creating the consequences. If you want to trade with us, you want to be a security partner with us, we want you to share our values. And it doesn't have to be exactly our values, but you want to be committed to pluralism, minority rights, constitutional government, democracy, sort of the basics. And, the U.S. partners should be the best in the world for defending human rights, not some of the worst. And that was the gist of the article. Like if human rights matters, we need to act like they matter. It'll cause headaches, but I've seen so many times over my career the tyranny of the urgent driving policies that we know are going to have a negative effect in 5 and 10 years. But the urgent crisis is this one issue, and so we mortgage the future to solve a problem now. That doesn't really solve the problem; it just makes a headache go away. We can't sell out the enduring for the immediate. And I hope this administration. I worked a little bit with Anthony Blinken when he was the Deputy Secretary of State. I know he cares about these issues. He talked about in his confirmation hearing how he had family members who are Holocaust survivors. So I'm hopeful that he will bring this in. The Trump administration on international religious freedom was very strong in highlighting these issues. Part of my article also was saying, there are some things I was very troubled by and some things I thought were very good. Keep the good stuff, like this Alliance for Religious Freedom, this high profile push on it. We were very, very mindful to do it in a nonpartisan way that was religious freedom for everybody. So I hope they'll continue that.
So one of the big things that we have covered a lot in the last year is this Christians against Christian nationalism notion. And one of our participants wants to ask this question. Looking at the experience of what we can learn from Germany, let's see if I can say this big word. In what ways did the denazification, if that's a word, after the aftermath of the Nazi movement in Germany, give us some tools that might be helpful for addressing Christian nationalism in the United States and finding a way out of that?
I don't know if I don't know enough about post World War II German sort of society to use that as a jumping off point, but just as someone who watched what happened on January 6th, and that was happening 8 miles down the road from where I live in a building that I had worked in, was shocking. And then to see these, Jesus save signs and the Christian flag going in, it really means a lot of the people on this call who pastor churches or have influential churches outside of the Beltway it's on to you all to try to confront that, to bring people back to a biblical understanding of, how do you protest, how do you exercise your rights, and then what you shouldn't do, like storming the Capitol is wrong, and it's criminal, and having an honest discussion on that, and that's going to be very hard. It's going to be uncomfortable. I was talking with my wife the other day about how, we have two boys, 13 and 12, and you don't talk about sex, religion, and politics at the dinner table. And because of that rule, no one knows how to talk about sex, religion, or politics in any constructive way, because to be polite, we stay away from it. And that sort of allowed these more extreme voices to fill that gap, to give people, well-meaning people who are brothers and sisters in Christ, a distorted view of biblical understanding. And it's going to take all of us to challenge that, to sit with them, to talk through it, and to make sure our views are heard and understood.
Yeah, I'm gonna quickly get through a few more questions here. Thanks, everyone. These are good questions. And some of these follow on to a previous discussion, so feel free to refer back if you need to on that. The Trump administration did a lot for international religious freedom in the way that you described, especially for Christians, but sometimes at the expense of being geared toward pandering, perhaps, to U.S. Evangelicals and conservative Catholics at some point. What do you think the Blinken State Department will do in regard to that issue? Knowing a little bit about him and his perspective, what should we anticipate moving forward?
Yeah. One of the interesting things of planning the two summits that we did, working on this alliance, I was representing the Trump administration's, one of their top foreign policy human rights priorities. And it was all about working with others, engaging our European allies, engaging countries in South America who support religious freedom, finding countries in Africa and Asia that share this value of diversity and freedom of belief. So we were very multilateral. In my experience, a lot of my work has been in the multilateral space. And we were doing that at a time when the rest of the Trump administration's foreign policy was pulling out of multilateral, pulling out of the Iran deal, pulling out of the World Health Organization, pulling out of Paris. And so there was like this disconnect, like on this one issue that I was working on, multilateral, and everything else, America first. But because of what we were able to build in this multilateral effort, the Biden administration you're already seeing, it's going to be automatically multilateral, rejoining Paris, rejoining WHO. So my hope is they will see this network that we created as a useful tool that will actually be very much in line with their approach to diplomacy. And it's going to be on an issue that, we did it in a nonpartisan way. Yes, there was the emphasis on Christian persecution, but Christians are being persecuted. Like, I don't think we should walk away from that reality because we're a majority Christian country. But we also talked about, and this was never appreciated, much to my consternation, the emphasis we put on Muslim persecution and Baha'i persecution and Yazidi persecution and atheist persecution. Like we advanced the right for all with specific advocacy on targeted groups. And I hope that's something I'm encouraged. I feel encouraged that this will be an issue that Mr. Blinken will pick up and empower to move forward and run with.
So there's a related question that's been asked that I think maybe is back to that parallel track thing you just talked about. So you have this work on religious rights for Muslims in other places, and yet you have the Muslim travel ban here. Is that just a case of left hand, right hand, or is there some actually coordinated thing to that we don't understand?
It was not coordinated. The Muslim travel ban was coming out of the White House. I worked at the State Department, and it did set up a disconnect. And I was proud that the things I was working on, I thought we were being successful in representing the best of American values, the best of American traditions, advocating for religious freedom for everybody. And I couldn't influence what was happening at the White House, but I could influence what was happening at the State Department. And, thanks to Ambassador Brownback, his leadership, and he was a very significant political figure in the administration, he really created that positive space that we could engage in the way that we did.
Okay, here's an interesting question. At least I think it's interesting. Something I hadn't thought about. It is, in what ways does our government's support of labor rights and labor rights guarantees in our diplomacy support or hinder support of religious rights? In other words, do you see any connection between the U.S. support of labor rights connecting to religious rights?
I haven't seen those two issues intersect. I've seen other, there's, when you do work on international law and international human rights, you talk about rights that conflict. Sometimes, two rights butt up against one another, and they're both equal in importance. So how do you decide that? The labor rights issue, I've never had enter into my inbox as a challenge. So I don't think it's a problem. I think you can do both successfully.
So there's another question. I'm going to paraphrase and expand just a little bit, and that is talking about white supremacy, which we know that's an issue we're talking about in the United States. I'm going to twist this question just a little to say, is white supremacy an issue in other countries around the world the way it is in the United States? How are we different or the same, right?
I mean, you certainly see in Europe sort of neo-Nazi skinhead violence, a lot of the anti-Semitism that pops up in Central and Eastern and even Western Europe has a far-right connotation to it. So I think they're coming from the same sort of line of thinking, the same motivations, the same concerns. And so, yeah, there are fellow travelers in other countries that conduct themselves in the same way and are motivated by the same ideology, certainly.
Yeah. As we move toward wrapping up, Knox, let me ask you, is there anything that we've not asked you about that you think is important for you to say? Any undelivered sermons burning in your heart?
Well, I did want to plug or highlight, for the Institute for Global Engagement right before Christmas, I led a webinar on Christian examples of peacemaking. And we timed it because we were then about to celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace. And what are ways that Christians have been peacemakers in other contexts? And we had a Catholic layperson from the Sant'Egidio movement who'd just come back from South Sudan and helped create a peace agreement between the different factions there. We had a Palestinian Christian woman, we had a Maronite priest from Lebanon, but I also included the dean of Shaw University's Divinity School. Shaw is the oldest historically Black college in the American South. And I wanted him to share about the role of the African American church in bringing peace in our context. And sort of an idea I've been thinking about and would love to dialogue further with you and others is, how do we get the African American church, the Black church, involved in these international issues? Because many of these things we're talking about, they've experienced, they struggle with, and they've had success in making our country better. We still have a long way to go, as we've all learned in recent months. But their voices aren't in the international work. They're just not there. And how can we create on-ramps so that we can benefit, those of us who work in the international space, we can benefit from their learned experience, the scars that they've taken on to make our country better, so that other countries wouldn't have to suffer what they've had to go through. So if anybody has ideas on that, I would love it, because I think this is a space where it's uncharted territory, and there's a lot of benefit that could be brought if we could involve the entire church in this work.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in an hour's time. I won't say we've been all the way around the world, but we've been to a lot of places in the world through this wonderful virtual tour. Knox, thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your heart and sharing this with us. Thanks to everyone who participated in this. And with that, we'll say thank you and good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.